So I did some research this week because I wanted to be sure that something I thought was actually true. Have you ever done that? There was this thing that I thought, and I was like, I want to research and dig into this and discover if it's true or not. And here's what I discovered that I already suspected. You become like the people you spend the most time with. So back in high school, a long time ago for me, some of my friends were skateboarders. I was not. And so I got into this thing called skateboarding back in the 80s, all right? So this was a while ago. And I started to hang out with more skaters. And I noticed that when I did that, I started to dress like my skater friends dress. I started to say, "That's rad." We said some things like that. Awesome was in that. But awesome came from that day. I think, is it making a comeback? People say awesome. Do you say, young folks, is that cool? I don't know what's cool anymore. But we would speak a certain way. We would dress a certain way. The skaters were known in my school for lining up in the hallway and holding our skateboards. I got to be honest, I'm just going to confess my sin. It was to look at the girls as they were coming in, right? And another thing that a lot of skaters did in the 80s, I was hanging out with a lot of them, doing a lot of what they were doing, is they would color their hair, like especially their bangs. Y'all want to see a picture? Now, if you're like, why is it so pixelated? That's a real picture. We didn't have cell phones and stuff. But you know what I notice on that picture is not the bangs, but the receding hairline already. I'm 16 years old. I look real happy that someone's taken that picture. But here's the deal. That's what they did. So it's what you become like the people that you spend a lot of time with. And so my whole life, or lifestyle, I'll say, became skateboarding and everything to do with it. The music I listened to, the way I dress, even my dad was so excited. There was this lady that would come to our house and dye my bangs for me. And he's like, "She's back." I'm like, "Dad, just..." Then I got into the rat. You ever hear of a rat tail? Not a real rat tail. I'm like, my dad was like, "I'm going to cut that thing off. What is that?" You know. You really start to become like the people you hang out with. That's why in this series called Practicing the Way, we've been spending the last several weeks saying, if you want to become like Jesus, you're going to have to spend some time with Jesus, right? And so over we introed the first week, and then we had two messages the last 2 weeks. If you missed them, I encourage you to check them out. Buy the book, Practicing the Way. Many of you are in the study that started a week late because of the huge ice storm, and then it was 70 degrees this week. I mean, what in the world? That started this past week, women's ministry, and some folks here on Wednesday night, and a lot of you are doing this on your own or in small groups. But in that book, one of the things that we're learning is that we need to be with Jesus. It's the first goal of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, a disciple, or the word that the book uses, John Mark Comer in the book Practicing the Way, the series that we're doing right now, is he says that we're apprentices of a teacher. Because in the first century, disciples were apprentices of a rabbi, and God sent his son Jesus into this world. He used the first century Jewish rabbinical system to teach us what it means to be disciples of Jesus, or I do like the word apprentices of a master and a rabbi. And so we need to be with Jesus. And so we've spent some time on this over the last few weeks talking about what it means to be with Jesus. And the whole point of that is so that we will get to the second goal, which is to become like Jesus. We spend time with Jesus so that we can become like Jesus. So that we can have the character, I'm going to use that language, the character of Jesus. What does that mean? That means you will have characteristics, that's character, that Jesus had. The same person Jesus was, his character, who he was, is who we will be. And Jesus himself, if you're like, well, I'm a far cry from Jesus and his character. I know it can feel that way, and we're going to talk about why today in this message and why we need to become like Jesus. But Jesus himself said that we're supposed to become like him. In Luke chapter 6, verse 40, one of the theme verses it's becoming in this series. Students, this is Jesus talking, or apprentices, I put that in parentheses, are not greater than their teacher or rabbi. But the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. So Jesus is like, y'all are supposed to become like me. As you spend time with me, you become like me. I like how John Mark Comer says it in the book Practicing the Way. I'm quoting him a few times. On page 69, he says, for Jesus, the point of apprenticeship was to be with him. We've already talked about that. That's the first goal of apprenticeship out of 3. For the purpose of becoming like him, which is the second goal of apprenticeship, which happens through an in-depth process of training. I want to share with you that for some of us, as we hear that and think about it, you're like, in-depth process of training? Who wants to have an in-depth process of training? Like when I became a pastor, I went through an in-depth process of training. It wasn't just seminary, it was then entering into mentorship with other people and stuff who taught me and helped me to become who I would become. I had to spend a lot of time. For me, it took 9 years, friends. Seminary took me 6 years. It was a 3-year degree, but I was working full-time and doing other things. And then after that, I had to you had to finish seminary before you could enter this other 3-year process after you had the degree of training to be ordained in the denomination that I was in. And so all of that, man, was just an in-depth process. And so the process, when it refers to being a Christian or a follower or an apprentice, that's what we're saying this is about, right? It's really, really important. And I think for some of us, it will take a paradigm shift to get there. A paradigm shift is where you look at the world one way and then you go, that's not the way I need to be looking at the world. I need to be looking at it this way. And so if you are feeling in your mind, why was I never taught this? Or I've never heard it this way or something like that, even in church, or you even go back at Quest Church and go, I'm not sure you always taught it this way, or it takes a paradigm shift sometimes to get to where we need to be. Here's why I say it takes a paradigm shift. I think if we're honest, many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, isn't it true that when it comes to Christianity, we view Christianity as a one-time event? What do you mean by that, John? Well, you get saved in a moment of time. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It does. If you're a Christian, a follower of Jesus, you are saved by Jesus. At some point, you got to decide, is that the life for you or not? Are you going to make a decision? At Quest, we often talk about saying yes to Jesus and a relationship with him. But we often view it as a one-time event. Well, I got saved. I'm saved. It happened, blah, blah, blah. Some of you can name a date. I cannot. I name a period of 2 years because that's when I remember becoming a follower of Jesus when I was about 12 years old, when it became serious to me. My parents raised me in it, and I kind of went through this period of time sitting on the back pew of a church. It can happen in the back, by the way. All right, where I decided, I think this is for me, and then it scared me, and then over a period of 2 years, I just somehow made a decision that this is the life I want, that my parents were teaching me, and I got involved in the student ministry, helping to lead as a student leader, all that kind of stuff, right? But it was kind of this moment in time for many of us, or a period of time, where you get saved, or some people say accept Jesus into your heart. Maybe you prayed a prayer and did that. Often what that means is we attend church. If we haven't attended church before, we do some church stuff, at the church. But at the end of the day, Christianity is kind of this thing that happened to us at a moment in time, and not much else changes about our lives after we say, I became a Christian. And so one of the things we're learning in this series, this is where the paradigm shift happened, is Jesus didn't invite his followers or apprentices to a one-time event. You can't do in-depth training in one event, in one moment of time. You can't become like Jesus just in a moment of time, right? Entirely. It takes not just getting saved, but being saved. I love how in the New Testament, by the way, you may not know this, that the word salvation and saved is often used in the present tense, meaning whenever it's happening, it's always happening, all right? So one of the things that we're learning is that this whole Christianity thing, as great as that is, and it can be a moment in time event, apprenticeship is more than that, right? To follow Jesus means more than a one-time event. And so I wrote this down. Apprenticeship isn't a one-time event, but an ongoing relationship with Jesus that changes our entire way of living. That's what this whole series is about. The reason we're calling it Practicing the Way is because we need, the early church was called the Way. It wasn't called Christianity, none of that. It was a derogatory term, by the way. Christianity was early on. It basically meant, hey, you guys are a bunch of little Jesuses. You guys are a bunch of little Christs, which meant that when people looked at them, they said, oh, they have the character and nature of the one that died and they say rose again, right? And so they were followers of something called the Way, not Christianity, because it was a way of life for them. And so that's what they called it. And so what we're learning here is, if you want the Christianity thing as just a one-time event thing, okay. But that's not what Jesus wanted for you and for me. It's not what he wanted the church to turn Christianity into, which we can do. This one-time event where you get saved, you accept Jesus into your heart is great. And that happens. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Don't hear. But it's ongoing, isn't it? It's a process of becoming like the Master, becoming like Jesus. Jesus, I'm going to remind you in the first week, I said he didn't walk up to his followers and say, hey, I've got this transaction I want to have with you. I want you to pray a prayer. I want you to see you later. Peace out. I hope you can figure it out from here. That's not what he did. He didn't want a transaction. He wanted transformation. That's what we said in the first week of this series, that Christianity is transformational, not transactional only. And so that's why we're talking about practicing the way, and what it means to follow Jesus is so over time, instead of just this one-time event, it's an ongoing process where we enter into this whole new way of life. Now, I feel like I'm saying this over and over in the series, but I just want to say it. Some of you are here, and this is really refreshing for you to hear. Because you're like, well, I've never really heard it said that way. I thought that might be. And some of you may not be Christians, and you have good reason for not being. The reason is you're like, well, I just look at the church and Christianity today, and it looks like this one-time event thing, but nobody changes. Y'all who are followers, you understand that's how the world looks at us. And they have good reason to very often. Because people say they're Christians and followers of Jesus, but nothing looks different about their lives. They wouldn't say, well, when I look at John, I'm looking at Jesus. The character and nature of who Jesus is so much in John, right? Or you, right? So often the reason people aren't Christians is because they look at Christians and they don't see Jesus. They see a one-time transactional event that's maybe happened, but not a transformation of life, this ongoing change. I'm not saying we're perfect at all. We're not. But this ongoing thing that is happening in us. So I don't know. I hope if you're not a Christian or you're kind of considering Christianity, that this will draw you. That you go, I'm interested in that. And if you are a Christian already, this is just a reminder, a challenge, a loving invitation really to what God has called us to. That it is more than a one-time event. It's an ongoing relationship with Jesus, who is our master, that we're becoming like him. So monks had an early phrase or words they used for what it meant to become like Jesus. Thomas à Kempis was the one who kind of originated this language. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's the imitation of Christ. He actually has a book about that, a devotional. It's old school, so it's a little hard to read, but it's deep, man. It's really good. the imitation of Christ. I mean, what I'm trying to do as a follower of Jesus, as an apprentice, is my life is supposed to imitate Christ. Does that make sense? That's a little different than this idea of Christianity that's a one-time event, and then I just kind of move on, but I'm not imitating Christ. We're supposed to be imitating Christ. That is the goal, the early monks said, is to become like Jesus. We don't use that language of imitation of Christ really anymore. We use other language to talk about this. Here's one of the words we use, discipleship. That's what this is. We have a discipleship pastor. Where's Dusty? Dusty right there. He's supposed to help you imitate Christ, right? I mean, really, discipleship is about not a one-time event. The reason we call it discipleship is because, hey, if you want to be a follower of Jesus, great. You want to say yes to Jesus, great, but you got to keep saying yes to Jesus every single day when you wake up and decide to live your life for Jesus. So discipleship is this idea of becoming like Jesus. Here's another word that was a little, we use the word discipleship more today, but a word that we used to use in the church, I like this language, is spiritual formation. That's about the journey that we're on. Now I want to dig into this second word just a little bit and talk about it and ask this. Why the word, I want you to, can y'all go deep today? You're like, oh man, drink another sip of coffee. Why formation? Because when you couple the word formation with spiritual formation, it's implying something. It's implying we're not where we could be, isn't it? Why do I need formation? Why do I need spiritual formation? What that implies is that something's off. Something's wrong. And if we think about it very long, we're like, yeah, something's off. Something's wrong. I'm not like Jesus, right? And so I want to talk about this for a moment. And when we think about this idea of spiritual formation, we're not where we could be. This isn't just about the spiritual. We're saying it's spiritual formation, but you could, under that you'd put emotional formation, relational formation, how to live, marriage formation, mental, how to think well, or right, if you want to use that language, but all of these other kinds of formations that happen under this idea of spiritual formation. When we say we're not where we could be, we're just all owning the fact that none of us have arrived at perfection, have we? None of us are perfect spiritually. Well, what happened? Why do we need spiritual formation? We're not where we could be. Why are we not where we could be? Well, can I take you back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27? It's interesting. Here's what it says. God created human beings in his own image. This is at the very beginning of time. I love that song, So Will I. When everything was formed, the galaxies and stuff like this, God formed us. So God made humans, that is you and me, in his own image. The Latin word is the imago Dei. Here's what that means. We look just like God. I want to skip down a few other verses. Our character was the character of God. But if you look at verse 31, it says this, then God looked over all he had made. We were the crown of creation, the last thing that he made, men and women. It said, then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was what? Very good. It wasn't just good, it was very good. So I was like, what does that mean? So I did a little bit of a word study on this very good. The Hebrew word, which I cannot pronounce, for very good, can be translated pleasant and all this, but one of the implications of the word, or one of the translations of the word, this is crazy, listen to this, is agreeable. God saw that it was agreeable. God saw that we were agreeable. What does that mean? Our character and nature was his character and nature. They agreed with each other. Let me ask you a question. Do you feel like your character and nature this past week has agreed with the divine? That who he is who you are in every aspect? right? Because if this was the case and this is where we were, God formed us in his image and made us to be like himself. But we don't feel like we have the character and nature of God anymore. And I'm implying that we got to have spiritual formation. Why? Genesis 3 teaches this. I'm not going to read it, but you can read Genesis chapter 3. Here's what happened. We sinned against God and deformed what God had formed. We rebelled. We destroyed what God had created. We marred it. We broke it. It's messed up. Using this idea of formation, we deformed what God had made. We went our own way. We decided we knew a better way. It was our agenda, not God's agenda. This is the fight every day, is it not? And in that moment, when that happened, sin entered the world and became a part of our nature as humans, and there was nothing we could do to get it back. So what God formed in us, don't miss this. This is deep. This is so important to understanding our condition and where we are and why we need spiritual formation. What God formed in us, his character and nature, we deformed. And that's called sin. So God would need spiritual formation to happen in us because we broke our emotions and we messed up our relationships. And so we would need God to come and help us with that. And if there was ever a chance, ever a hope for us to become like God again, to restore that broken image in us, we would need spiritual formation. But I actually think we should probably call it this, spiritual reformation. So this idea of spiritual formation and discipleship is really spiritual reformation, spiritual reformation. Because what happened? What God formed in us, we deformed. And so God has now come to reform us, to bring us back into the likeness of himself. That's what's really happening. In fact, I wrote this down. Jesus came to bring a reformation of life to you and to me. This is what becoming like Jesus is all about. Becoming like Jesus means you recognize that God formed you in his character and likeness. You deform that every day in your sin. You're born with it. There's nothing you can do about it to get to God yourself. And so you need a reformation, which means you need Jesus. All right. Y'all with me? Are y'all with me? I used to say that more. I got to check now because I don't want to leave anybody behind. It's really important that we kind of arrive at the same place, and that you may not agree with all this or believe it all, but just follow me here. What is God trying to reform in us through an ongoing relationship with Jesus? We've said his character, right? All right, so what is the character of God? If that's what God's trying to reform, that which we deformed, that the image of God in us, he's trying to reform in us. And that's why Jesus has come, is to bring us back into that relationship and help us reform the image of God. This is the whole process of in-depth training, of discipleship, of spiritual formation or reformation, if you will. God has so many characteristics, man. I could go on and on and on. You'd never get out of here today. So I just want to talk about the central characteristic for a moment of God, of all the many characteristics. And if this is the one, I would say, more than any other, God's trying to form in you. All right, if you want to become like Jesus, you're going to become more this way with what I'm talking about. Let me share a few scriptures with you. It'll be very easy to figure out what this characteristic is. I even underlined it for you. It says in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son." The reason Jesus came into this world was because God loved us. It wasn't just to reform us, it was because God loved us and wanted to restore and reform the image that was broken at creation when we sinned. That whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. That's Jesus' words right there, by the way, to a guy named Nicodemus in the first century while Jesus walked on this earth when he said, "What are you doing here? Jesus is like, this is what I'm doing here. Paul, though, he was a first century follower of Jesus. He wasn't at first, and then his life was radically changed in a moment of time, but then everything about his character and nature changed. He hated Christians. He began to love Christians. This became the central character of Paul. And so Paul wrote some stuff, too, about this central characteristic that you guys are already catching what it is. 1 Corinthians 13:13, used a lot in weddings. And now these three things remain. After this long diatribe about, hey, you can have this gift and this talent and all that, I'm paraphrasing, this thing, but if you don't have love, it's worthless, is what Paul says. And he goes, in fact, these three things remain at the end of time: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest, talk about a list. Which one's the most important? What does Paul say? But the greatest of these is what? Love. All right, so there's this idea of greatest of all the stuff is love. All right, Colossians 3:12-14. I often use this in weddings. I love this. Therefore, as God's chosen people, if you're a follower of Jesus, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves every day. He uses this idea of putting on clothes. With a lot of things, this is the character of God: compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, patience. This is other characteristics of the Creator that we deformed in us. If you're not patient, it's because you deformed it with your sin, just like I did. Right? But we're supposed to have it. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And then Paul says, and over all these virtues, kind of like the last one, the greatest thing, like over all these, put on what? Love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Because if you act patient, or if you are patient, but you are mean and hateful, people don't buy the patience thing. If you forgive somebody, but then gossip about them behind their back, people don't buy the forgive thing, do they? Right? Love is what binds it all together. Let me give you one more. It's all over the New Testament, but Galatians 5 says the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives. All right, so here's 9 characteristics of God, the one who created us, that we deform these things. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Are they all important? Sure. Look what Paul leads with. Love. All right, so that's just a central characteristic that God wants to form in us as we're being reformed into His character, as we're becoming like Him. Here's how you know you're becoming more and more like the rabbi, the master, is you will have this characteristic, love. All right, but that needs to be defined because, I love green beans. Is that the same way I'm supposed to love you? Right? We use the word love all the time, but I'm not going to give up my life for green beans. I'll give up the green beans instead of giving up my life. But when it comes to the Jesus stuff, why did I say green beans? I should have said wings, brisket, all kinds of other good stuff. But it's not just any kind of love. It's this kind, sacrificial love. So whenever you think of love and you think of biblical love, sacrificial love, there's a New Testament word for the love of God, which is agape love. It's a sacrificial kind of love. It's a selfless. See, we can love selfishly instead of selflessly. It's sacrificial. What does that mean? It means I put you first, me second. I'm willing to come under you to serve you. That's what marriage is supposed to look like. That's what friendship is supposed to look like. It's like a fight for who's going to serve the other person. Let me get the door for you. No, let me get the door for you. No, let me get the door for you. That should be the way it goes. And nobody's ever walking through the door because we're fighting over who's going to get the door for the other person, right? This idea of sacrificial love. You're like, okay, I have a lot of characteristics. I'm not sure I'd say sacrificial love tops the list. I mean, you can ask your spouse if you're married or whatever, hey, have I been doing that this week or this year, Because, see, a lot of these things are deformed in us because of our sin and brokenness. You're like, I'm not sure I'd say that's at the top of my character. When somebody looks at me, they look at John, and they say, he is becoming like Jesus. He is sacrificially loving. But that's what it means to become like Jesus more than anything else. When we get to this point, here's what we do. You know what we do? Some of us right now are like, I'm in. This has been a paradigm shift for me. This is hard. It's a challenge. But here's what I'm going to do, Pastor. I'm going to try harder. This is what, right? How many times do we do that? I tell you this, if you could explain my early Christian life, it's try harder. Because I'd go to an event, I'd hear a speaker, I'd be in church, I'd be at summer camp when I was a student, whatever, and they would be sharing real truth, real good stuff, and I'd be like, I'm messed up. I wouldn't have said I'm deformed, but I've deformed all of this. I still got my cool blonde bangs, but everything else is messed up. They didn't last for long. This all started to go in college, right? So I'm going to try harder. Let me let you in on something. Won't work. Trying harder doesn't work because the emphasis is you. The emphasis is like, I got to do something. John Mark says something really interesting in his book, Practicing the Way, and I just love it. I'm just thought of it. He says, Christianity isn't something you do. It's something done to you by God. Becoming like Him happens when you spend time with Him. You'll get to the point where eventually the last 2 weeks of this series are going to be, you're going to start doing stuff Jesus did. Actually, with your hands and your life, you're going to start doing things He did. Be with Him. Become like Him. Eventually. Do what He did. Some of us want to skip the being with, the becoming like, so we can just do what He did. We can't. And you can't just try harder. Here's what I want to suggest to you. Instead of trying harder, do this. Surrender to Jesus daily. A little bit different. You're like, well, I got to try to do that. I get it. Surrender to Jesus daily. All right, I want to focus on that word because we use this word too much, probably in church, surrender. And we're not going to sing, I surrender all, you church people. We could have, but we're not. You're like, oh man, come on. I want you to think about the word surrender for just a moment. Surrender is a term used in war. When there's a battle. And see, there is a battle every single day that rages in you, which is, will I surrender to God and His agenda, or am I just going to live in this deformed state of my nature and say, I'm going to do it my way, God? I'll even try harder. I'll earn this, right? You can't. Surrender is a term of war where two sides are fighting against each other, where both sides want to win. Can I share something with you? You want to win in the battle with God. You ever thought about that? Because surrender's where you say, you win, God. I can't do it anymore. So our lives are like that. And we think of surrender as losing, right? Like I lost. When one side in a war surrenders to the other, it's lost. It's like I lost. Surrender is hard. So when I say surrender to Jesus, that is no flippant little emotion. This is hard to do. Amen? Because there is a battle going on in you every single day. But when we surrender and place ourselves under the way of Jesus, we discover something truly ironic. When I surrender to Jesus, I don't lose. I win. See, when you surrender in war, you lose. The other side comes in and takes you off something. No, when you surrender to Jesus, you're under His authority. What you're saying is, I surrender to who you've made me to be. I want to be reformed into the nature and image, your central character, especially this idea of sacrificial love. This is what I'm made for. So I did a little other research. For centuries, the central sign of surrender in war has been a white flag. You guys probably know that. Interesting. It started being used as, you come out of the ditch, you're like, enough. We surrender. The white flag, though, means something interesting. As I did some study, it's more than just I give up. You know what it also means? I need peace. This war thing is not working. We need peace. We need peace between these two sides. And it's time for somebody to give up. It's time for somebody to surrender, to wave the white flag and say, I surrender to you. Can I let you in on something? God ain't ever going to wave the white flag and bow down to you. He's not going to do it. For some of us, that's a word. It's important because I'm here to let you know He loves you so much, He will never wave the white flag and say, fine, I'm going to let you out. I'm going to keep loving everybody else, but you just go do your own thing, have your own way, have your own agenda. He will never wave the white flag again. See, Jesus waved the white flag. It was called the cross. Jesus on the cross said, I surrender to the will of my Father. I surrender and let you put my body on this cross, and it'll be broken and torn and bleed. And I'm going to show you that when you surrender, you don't lose, you win. God used the cross to win. Think about the cross as a white flag. Jesus said, carry the cross, wave the white flag of surrender with your life. So my question for us today, and we're going to go into the practical ways that God wants to form us, spiritually form us, and reform us next week. Pastor Dusty's bringing a great message on that. All right? So come back and hear that. But for today, I just want to ask you, what's it going to be? Today, what are you going to do? You're going to keep fighting God, or are you going to surrender so that you can become exactly who He's made you to be, which is like Him?